Welcome, everyone. This is the Center for Children and Families' 12th annual lecture series. It's hard for me to believe, but we're very excited to get started this spring, number 12. So I guess we can't say we're 10 years old anymore, because obviously we're not. We've gone beyond that. And I want to welcome you to the Center for Children and Families annual event. The Center for Children and Families is a center here at the University of Texas at Dallas, very devoted to education, research, and to outreach services in the community, all to try to advance the healthy development of children and families. And I want to thank our two sponsors for this spring's lecture. One, the Center for Teaching and Learning, and we will have refreshments across the hall. You may have discovered them already. And thanks to the United Way of Metropolitan Dallas, who is also a sponsor of this spring's lecture series. And I want to introduce Dr. Candace Mills, who is an affiliate faculty member of the Center for Children and Families, and she organizes very beautifully the lecture series, and she will introduce our speaker today. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. One quick announcement. If you need to exit as the talk is going on, there is an exit right in that corner of the back so that you don't have to walk up front, which can feel quite awkward. I had a student, I teach in this class sometimes, and had a student come up and walk in front of the class. What did I do? So thank you all for joining us today. Our speaker today is Dr. Jaret Hodges. He received his bachelor's degree from Ashford University, his master's degree from the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Houston, and his Ph.D. from the Department of Educational Studies at Purdue University. His postdoctoral work was at Duke University, which you may have heard of before as being really involved with the Duke Talent Identification Program. Also, like TIP, you might have gotten mailings about this when you were in, say, 7th grade or so. So it's a well-known program that helps to support students who are gifted or otherwise advanced learners. In addition to his formal education, he also worked as a special education teacher in Texas in Gonzales ISD. He's like, does anybody know where Gonzales ISD is?
Oh, that was going to ask that.
It's outside of San Antonio. I did look it up to see. Right now, Dr. Hodges is currently an assistant professor at the University of North Texas. His research focuses broadly on gifted education. One of his colleagues, Cynthia Frosch, let us know that a recent paper of his on Washington's high ability programs was nominated for Paper of the Year from the Journal of Education of the Gifted, which I thought was pretty cool. He's done lots of really interesting research. Most specifically, as connected to this talk, his work is focusing on understanding the needs of students who might benefit from gifted education, along with the policies that might most effectively identify them and serve them. A significant issue is that students from populations traditionally marginalized in their local schools are frequently not identified to be supported by gifted programs. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, so what? Why does that matter? And in some cases, maybe it's just that they're not reaching their full potential, and I'll argue that just being a just kind of thing. But in other cases, these children are labeled as problem children because they are having trouble in their traditional classrooms, and their behavior is not interpreted in scope of what else might be leading to this kind of behavior. So I think it's important for many reasons for us to think more about how we best support and identify these students in the future. So today, Dr. Hodges will speak about how we can identify and support gifted students, regardless of his background. His talk is titled, Identifying and Meeting the Needs of Gifted Students from Diverse Populations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jaret Hodges.
Oh, thank you. Make sure everything is everything on? Awesome. So a little bit about my background and the journey to gifted ed. So yes, not only was I in life skills or special ed, I was in life skills, and I was in a self-contained classroom. So if any of you have been in a school, self-contained is usually the room with the children for more severe needs. And so I went from there and through alternative certification as well on top of everything, all the way up to Duke Tip, where I did my postdoc, and now working in at UNT in the gifted education program there. So it's always interesting. So how did you go from life skills, and those children, where did your interest of that develop? So I was at Gonzales ISD at a very interesting time. Has anyone ever been through Gonzales or aware of, it's the birthplace of Texas independence, Come on, come and take it, So I was in Gonzales at a very interesting time. The interesting time that happened was in Gonzales was when the district faced a lawsuit from the Office for Civil Rights. So what happened was, while I was through there in Gonzales Elementary, a parent walked through the in-school suspension room there and looked in and saw only little boys who were black and brown. And then the parent walked and saw the gifted education classroom and saw only little children who were white. And she called the Office for Civil Rights right after that. And so in the midst of that, I got to experience, and this wasn't something that happened in like 1980s Gonzales, 1970s Gonzales. This was 2010 Gonzales. So the ramifications of that was the district trying to bring diversity within the gifted ed program. A few things happened. White flight. People exited the district and went to the Catholic school, the parochial school in Shiner. That was a big issue. You had huge fights in the school board talking about lowering standards within the district. The district is lowering standards. What are we doing? But in a way, the Office for Civil Rights decided that Gonzales had to change, and so they did. But this experience kind of said, what's going on here? So I ended up emailing a professor at Purdue and talked to him about my experience and a little bit about my background. And she said, well, wouldn't you want to look into that a little more? Why don't you come on up here and we can look into it? And so that's what I did, from there. And one of the things that I found out was in life skills, like in self-contained, when something's on an IEP and it says you must differentiate, there's no, do I feel like it or how am I doing it? Well, you got to do it. And when it says document, you have to document. That's one of the big things that I've found coming from special education to gifted education is the big difference between like pedagogical practice and classroom practice and applications is instead of you will, in the context of like life skills, in the context of special educations, it's you can if you want. So in Texas, we have this idea of local control. Special education doesn't have a lot of local control. Texas got in trouble for its local control with special education. They got in a lot of trouble, but there's a lot of local control with the gifted ed in Texas. So whenever we talk about identifying and meeting the needs of diverse populations, almost forgot this. There's the elephant in the room. So that's code for something when you see this in academic literature, when you see this in conference presentations, when you see this here in this talk. What does this mean? Well, it's really code for something that's been going on in this country for probably the past 50, 60 years, which is the underrepresentation of different student populations. And again, that's code too. What does it mean by that? We mean the underrepresentation of students who are black, the underrepresentations of students who are Latinx, of students who are Native American, of students from low socioeconomic areas, and students who are English language learners, and also students from rural areas. That's what it means. You see that a lot. Like if you go and you do a Google search for underrepresentation, you'll see a lot of underrepresented populations in the United States. This notion, it's this big umbrella term, but we really mean a few groups of students who are, almost traditionally, or this overarching systemic underrepresentation, which has been gifted ed. And that's one of the big problems of gifted education. And you are seeing some areas taking very drastic steps to meet their needs. New York City made the news. They were just going to get rid of a lot of their gifted ed program. Seattle, here in Texas, we just had funding removed for it. So there are some drastic steps being taken in order to bring about equity, in order to get, to deal with the big elephant in the room. So here's what you can expect. What we know about underrepresentation. Causes for underrepresentation. Everybody has their 2 cents for that. Possible solutions for identification, because to meet the needs of students, you got to figure out which students to meet or what needs. The next one is meeting the needs, and finally, future directions. So that's a bit of what you can expect. I love this cartoon. I love it. So in it, you could see it's this hey, what do we have to do with education? And this other person has this idealistic, we just need to let teachers be creative. We just need to stop teaching for the test. Oh, we just need to, if only we let these classroom teachers just be themselves in the classroom, that would solve everything. Gosh, man, I always think this, I'm like, has this person been into a Title I school? Have they been in somewhere where there's children who face, don't have good access to nutrition? Children who face, maybe don't sleep as well at night. These whole larger systemic issues of society, and this cartoon makes it sound so easy, but it's meant to be so profound. That's what I love about this cartoon. It's meant to come off as something profound when really the issues and the problems and the causes are really complex. It's not like this one little thread. It's more like a spider web. A lot of gray areas too. So I love that cartoon. Probably not for the reasons that the author or that the artist intended. So here's what we know. Like I said, these particularly Black, Native American students and Latinx students are underrepresented in high ability programs across the United States. And I love those 3 citations too. Not just because one of them is mine, but but I love those 3 citations. 1998, we knew it. 2009, we knew it then. And we still know it in 2018. So it shows this, I love those 3 citations together because it shows that this is a problem that scholars in our field have been aware of for a long time. And we've been trying to figure out what to do for a long time. Here's another one. Identification is not enough. You can't just say, Texas has been doing that, like with their AP courses, where we've been saying, let's get them into AP. Let's just get them into the classes. And then none of the students who might not have had any educational needs met for elementary, middle school, come into AP classes, they don't make 4s and 5s on the test. And a lot of them don't take the exam in the first place. And Texas is like, well, we opened the door for them. We let them in. That's all it took. Sometimes it takes a little more than just saying, come on in. And here's the last one. There's a whole wide breadth of policies and practices that people are trying. There's a lot of different solutions that people are looking at. We'll look at a few states like that. Things that states have tried, things that a lot of them are strongly rooted within research, within theory, that scholars are saying you need to do this. So you've had scholars within different states come into state legislatures and said, if you do this, this will lead to more equitable identification. And more equitable identification will lead to being able to meet the needs of these students because then you'll be able to modify the curriculum to meet their needs. So we'll look at a few states and what's been done. So I gave you, this is in your handout. I love, or this is another graph. I don't like it, but it really shows kind of the overall issue, the systemic issue across the United States. So what you're looking at in these two is something called a representation index. A representation index is used throughout my field to quantify this idea of underrepresentation. It compares one group of students, how they're represented in gifted ed, to another group of students. And these are at the state level. So this first one says, any of these that are at 1 means that students who are Black are identified within schools in that state at the same rate of students who are white. So that's what we usually compare with in our field. And as you can see, the vast majority of states know. This is where this idea of underrepresentation gets tossed around with. And one word that's being used differently now within my field that is kind of catching on that I like a lot, it's this idea of well representation. Before, we used to say in our field, and you'd see it in academic literature, that students who are white or students who are Asian are overrepresented in gifted education programs. You'd hear that a lot. Overrepresentation, underrepresentation. But it's the connotation of overrepresented seems like it's a bad thing, that there's more who've been identified, that this is bad that we are providing services to these children, that they shouldn't be provided. So scholars have thought a second and said, let's go with well represented. We have an underrepresented population or groups, and then we have well represented, groups of students where their needs are being met. So we don't want to say these other groups of students, bring them down, which you will see in the future in some of these slides and some of these solutions that are brought forth, but we want to bring these other groups up to a similar level. So you can see here, our state of Texas. You will not see any ones for us for Texas across groups. And Texas identifies a big chunk of students as gifted. About 7% of all students who go to schools in Texas are identified as gifted, which is above the state, or which is above the average for the United States. And one thing to think about for Texas prior to this past summer only funded up to 5%. So that extra 2% was coming straight out of district pockets, without any support from the state. So that's one thing. So when you think and you look at this and you say, Texas needs to be doing more. Texas needs to be doing more. Our districts aren't doing enough. There are a lot of people in the districts who are working very hard, who are trying to stretch budgets of what they have, who are working. But like I said before, this social spider web of societal effects, that's hard to overcome just in the school, to just do it only from the school. So here, I love this one too, causes. And this is like two scholars. This is when you go, if you were to go to like one of our conferences and you would go to like a, let's say an editorial board meeting. And you were to ask the editorial board of our top journal and say, what are the causes of underrepresentation? In about 5 minutes, that's what the board meeting would look like. About 5 minutes, maybe even sooner than that. So that's actually what it was like a few years ago when they talked about this. There's a lot of people with a lot of different opinions and a lot of different beliefs on what the causes of underrepresentation are. And a lot of them are very passionate about their beliefs. You will have some who will say that the beliefs is, that a part of the cause is due to a lack of training in teachers. You know, you'll say there's not enough professional development. The teachers aren't able to recognize. A lot of districts use something called teacher referrals, where the district will go to your teacher and say, which one of your students should be identified as gifted? We only have so much money for these tests. Like, here's one thing to kind of give you an idea of money. How much, can we get a quick guess? How much do you think it would cost to use an identification procedure for all students in a grade? There's a flat licensing fee. What do you think Pearson's flat licensing fee to administer?
For Texas?
For Texas. It's flat.
I'm not going to give you an answer. I'm just asking.
Yeah, for Texas. For a Texas school district that wants to administer an online test, like a computer test, to its district, what's its cost? How much does that run the district? Any guesses?
Per district?
Per district.
Oh, per district.
20,000. We're getting close, but we're still way under.
Okay, 100,000.
A little over $50,000 to cost for a district. It costs $50,000 to let kids sit in front of a computer, log on to a site, and take a test. So for large districts, this is not something that's small. You know, like Austin ISD wanted to implement something like this, and the superintendent told them too much. That's too much. We have our other priorities. We're doing other things. $50,000, that pays for a teacher. You know, that's a teacher's salary. And we're going to get another teacher rather than pay for this test. For a rural school district, that might as well be $2 million, you know, $10 million, if we're talking about some of the rural school districts in Texas. So my look of where I look at on the causes of some of this, of underrepresentation, are allocation of resources. So there are certain costs, which are like fixed costs, which districts face, which certain districts, it puts certain programs and certain identification means out of their reach. Like say for rural school district, I've heard it called teeth and tail for costs, where teeth are the teachers, you get them in the classroom, that's a big chunk of a school district's where it allocates its budget. It's buying teachers. And every time a superintendent is faced with a cost, like $50,000, a superintendent has to decide, do I want to give another or hire another teacher, or do I want to do this? And a lot of times, I haven't seen many superintendents that I've talked to that have said, you know what, we don't need more teachers, we need this program. So that's one of the areas of causes that I look at, is this allocation of resources. Other causes that are looked at, some are that are looked at are biases within teachers, which we'll look at a little bit, and biases within the school. There's a lot of people who will say these tests aren't working because they are biased against these different populations. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that, because these populations, particularly students who are Black and Latinx, perform lower on them. So you can either say the solution is, there's two explanations. My advisor put it this way, that there are two possible explanations. And she wanted to drive home the point. Marcia Gentry, she said, either you can believe that there's something wrong with the students, or you can believe that there's something wrong with the tests. And she said, I'm not going to say that the problem is with the students. So that was her outlook of how she thought of things. And that's been a really concise way to put this gap. So that's one of the thoughts, that there could be, the issue could be the test that we're using. So here's one that research has shown. So it's really, really hard to test for these things in school. It's really hard to do a statistical procedure. One, because you can't deny certain students things that you think will help them. IRB will never approve that. If you say, I'm only going to give half the students this treatment, it's good for everyone, maybe I'll roll it out. Eventually you can do it like that. But there's still some issues. You can't give or there's just some issue of ethics which makes things hard to test and hard to run randomized controlled trials within schools working with student populations. Here's one that was done where we looked at teacher referrals by Grissom and Redding, 2015, where they looked at the ECLS, and they wanted to know, based on who got identified, what kind of teacher you had. So they compared students who were black with students who were white. And what did they find out? They found out that students who were black were much more likely to be referred for gifted ed services when their teacher was also black, much more so than white. So this is a phenomena where that's across cultures that have been measured, that people tend to think that if someone is similar to you, they're smart like you. You are smart, thus people who share and are similar to you are also smart. And people who are different from you might not be as smart as you. That's something that's been measured across cultures, and it's kind of encapsulated right here, where students and teachers are more likely to nominate students who are similar to them. And when you have a primary teaching staff, which is predominantly women and white, you see those are largely that the students who are referred to gifted education services are girls, and are girls who are white. And that's one of those things where you have to say it's hard to say how much of that is society and how conception of these other populations are pervaded in society, which might create this, versus something which is innate. So it's really, really hard to disentangle that. So here's one we're looking at UNT, and particularly within the DFW area, which is this idea of resegregation going on here. So if you have gone into any of the schools, maybe Richardson is a good example of that right here, or Plano or Frisco, certain schools are getting more white and they are getting more Asian, and other districts in the area are getting more black and more Latinx. You are just seeing this pull away. And this is one of these things that we're looking at UNT, is how is this resegregation of like a metropolitan area affecting services? How is it affecting identification? Are schools, as they become less diverse, are they identifying less of their students? You know, say for example a school district, I'll use Dallas ISD, or not to use Dallas, let's use someone let's use Austin, you know, something down I-35. You know, the traffic is terrible there, so they deserve it a little bit, you know. So Austin is a good example for this, because they are one of the fastest economically growing areas in the United States. Austin, Atlanta, Raleigh-Durham, those are the big three right now as far as economic growth. A lot of money is coming into these areas, a lot of money. But all that money, you are not seeing educational attainment rising. You are seeing populations which before all that money came in not get identified, not have services provided for them, and after all that money, not get identified and not have services provided for them, despite the fact that there's massive increases of wealth coming into the district. And you'll have state legislators say, and the district say, well, that's because it's all getting reappropriated. Robin Hood is keeping us from educating our children. We're not able to do it because of Robin Hood. Are you guys familiar with what Robin Hood is? Where in Texas, if a district is above a certain property tax threshold, the state will come in, yank all that money away, and redistribute that. Oh, districts have loved using this as saying why we are not able to meet our students' needs, because the state is taking all of our money. So in Austin, you are having areas like where the city or the metropolitan area is becoming more black and more Latinx, and you're having the north area, Georgetown, Round Rock, becoming more white and more Asian. And you're having this pull apart. And an economist named Raj Chetty has studied this extensively, this pull apart within these large metro areas and how this affects educational attainment. So one of the things that we're looking at, and that our big hypothesis is that this is one of the driving forces of underrepresentation, of modern underrepresentation, like a modern cause for it, is this, this resegregation which is going on in metropolitan areas. So this is another one. I've got a lot of cartoons that I picked because I love them. This one makes it always seem so easy when you have like these problems. You have a problem, you get the solution, success. It's easy. It's like a little three-way stairs. You just have to do this. If we just do X, you'd solve it. And this is what we're going to look like, because in the 2000s to 2010s, you had a lot of states and a lot of school districts have scholars come in and tell them, you need to do this. Let me tell you how to fix this problem. And so the state said, yes, okay, you got a Ph.D., you got a lot of letters on your name, you must know something. You must know something we don't. We're going to defer to you. And so you had a lot of states try different things. You had our state of Texas try something. You had Florida try something. You had Washington. You had Indiana. You had all these other states enact policies to try to raise up different students, help them be identified, provide them more access to services, because there is a little bit of a pipeline in there. You have students, it's something called the Matthew effect. We look at it where those who already have get something at elementary school, they get a little bit ahead of others, they get more in middle school, they get a little more ahead, and in high school, they're AP, dual credit, they're making 4s and 5s, and they're way ahead. And it's the idea of the rich get richer. So, okay, richer getting richer, but we want to help these other populations of students also get richer. You know, let's identify those who most benefit from this, who benefit most from these curriculums, and help them get in there, and help them go to college, and help them be successful. So here are a few solutions that were provided. One thing, though, to say this before I talk about solution, it's some of these terms are very, very, very complex, particularly Asian, Black, Latinx, Native American, White. I'll use Asian as an example, because when we say Asian in gifted ed and well representation, we mean largely East Asian populations. We mean Chinese, we mean Japanese, we mean South Korean. Usually that is what's meant. It's not meant usually Southeast Asians or Filipinos who have different levels of educational attainment. So that's a lot of complexity. I'll use Houston to take another city with students who are Black. Houston, for a while, they got in trouble with the state, to kind of put that out. But for a few years, they were really proud of the progress of their Black community, of the students who are Black within the district. They're like, look what we are doing with our students here in Houston ISD. Look how we are serving them. Look how we are raising test scores. Now, if you added a very interesting variable, or you controlled for something, you would see that things weren't as good as they would say. If you controlled for the immigrant status of a child, particularly Houston is home to one of the largest Nigerian communities in Texas, you would see that the population, of students who are Black, their educational outcome depends on their immigrant status of their parents. So when we say Black, what we mean are students who are referred to as African American, traditional Black populations within the United States, as opposed to immigrant Black populations from Africa. You can say the same for English language learners. When you see in gifted education literature where it's talking about English language learners, what it's primarily discussing is students who are Latinx, and not so much students who are English language learners from India or students who are English language learners from East Asia. The same ones with rural. Bee Cave is rural, outside of Austin. Bee Cave is or was rural. You know, that's, if you're aware of Bee Cave, that's about Highland Park. So that's a rural community. But that's different from the rural of Appalachia. You know, that's a different kind of rural. And it's a different kind of rural than the Mississippi Valley area or Delta area. And it's a different kind of rural than the Navajo Reservation. That's a different kind of rural. And low SES. This is when we faced at Purdue, working with at our student programs there, because we had a program where we allowed students who qualified for free and reduced lunch services to get subsidies to enter in the student program. Purdue has a lot of graduate students. Graduate students don't make much money. Or I didn't as a graduate student. You know, I remember getting like $100 and we'd call it graduate student rich. You know, you're grad student rich. But you qualify for free and reduced lunch services, but we understood at Purdue that there's qualitatively something different about the children of graduate students who qualify for free and reduced lunch services and the children of immigrants from Mexico who also qualify for free and reduced lunch services. We qualitatively understood that and understood there was nuance. So within all these categories, when we talk about underrepresentation, you see those 4 categories talked about a lot. Within there is a lot of nuance within them. So here's the first one, Florida. We'll talk about Florida. We had scholars in Florida tell them what you need to help meet the needs is do an alternative identification service. So what does that mean is that in Florida, if you go there and you qualify for free and reduced lunch services, or you are participating in an English language learner program, your district can use an alternative identification service. Because in Florida, one way to go into gifted ed is to be identified with 130 IQ, 130, IQ test. This other way said, no, this is not working very well to identify students who are Black or Latinx particularly, or students from free and reduced lunch services who participate in those or qualify, or students who are English language learners. And Florida is interesting because you have areas in Florida which are the Panhandle area, and then you have Miami-Dade, you know, massive area, massive populated areas, and that's the state flag of Florida. So here's what you see, and what do you notice? What do you notice? They did lower representation. They closed the gaps of representation here. Here's over here on the right, or on the right, to make it sure, you see the normal plan. You see Asian and our students who are Asian and white are well represented. Students who are Black, Hispanic, and Native American aren't as well represented. And over here you see those gaps have been lowered. Florida did it. They solved it. But that's probably not what they wanted to do, not the way that they wanted to lower the gap. So they lowered their gap by identifying less students who are Asian and less students who are white. That is one way to close the gap, just identifying less. As you can see, that didn't work as well as Florida planned. The next one, Indiana. Indiana is a state where Purdue was at, and there was a big interest in Indiana because it is, as far as states, it has one of the fastest growing Latinx populations in the United States. Just probably number 3, I think, in the nation. So yeah, when people think of Indiana, they think of cornfields. That's what I thought of. So we used to say at West Lafayette, where I did it, where Purdue at, we would say West Lafayette is a great place to study. It's a great place to work on your Ph.D. because there's just cornfields. There's West Lafayette, the university. If you love cornfields, there's a lot to do. But if you don't, you have a lot of free time to study. No distractions there. Or no distractions at Purdue. Like here in Dallas, there's a lot to distract you. Nothing like that at West Lafayette. You could focus and hone in. But one of the things about that Indiana is you had areas which were predominantly white, generationally. Places and school districts who had been like 95, 99% white for almost the entire conception of the school district. And all of a sudden, within the past decade, the last census, you see this diversity that has been coming in within the states of largely students who are Latinx and largely students who are English language learners have come into Indiana. And there has been growth pains, and there's been a lot of look of how schools are adjusting in Indiana to meet the needs, especially when, like in Texas, school districts can work to meet the needs of students who are English language learners. There's something in place. There's this institutional knowledge within districts of how to meet these students' needs. There's institutional knowledge within administrators of what to do. Indiana didn't necessarily have that. So what did Indiana decide to do? They said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to let districts have multiple pathways to identification. You know, not only can you be identified with an IQ test, you can be identified with math ability, you can be identified with verbal ability, and you know what, districts, you can come up with a performance, your own thing to identify students. We just want to get this gap closed in Indiana. We want to meet these needs, we just want to do it. So I love this too. Which one of these, which is which? Which of these is IQ only, and which is all possible paths? And if you can't tell a difference from the two, you know, me either. You know, so that's one of the issues, and this highlights one of these overarching issues that you'll find in this talk is that there are societal issues that are at play that one single intervention isn't going to overcome. One single intervention is not going to do it. So telling a district, you know what, you don't just have to use an IQ test, you can use an alternative method is not going to certainly fix all these societal ills that a community might be facing. Washington, this is another state. So in Washington, it's different. In Washington, gifted education is a constitutional right for school districts. So if a parent is denied services, if their child gets identified as gifted, and the district tries to deny them services, the state will come in and say, no, that is the constitutional right of the student. So the state constitution mandates gifted education services as a basic right or a basic component of education. Here you have the same thing as Florida. You have these massive, heavily populated areas around the Sound, and then you have the forest past the mountain, and the capital, Spokane. So what Washington allowed districts to do to alleviate these gaps of representation is let districts identify at different ages. So the thinking amongst scholars was if we can identify sooner and we can identify them when they're younger, we can provide interventions earlier. We can provide interventions earlier, get to them, help them sooner. So that was the thinking behind there. So Washington districts, you have some districts that only provided services starting in high school, and some that provided services all the way in kindergarten. So you can kind of compare like how the representation looks. So what did I find? Well, nothing. Nothing. That's what it looked like when you compared. It didn't matter. There was no difference between the two. Whether a school district identified started in kindergarten and they identified as soon as possible, or they waited till high school to provide services. Or particularly students who were Black, students who were Latinx, or students who were Native American were just not identified, regardless of the time it was or when they were identified. And our state, Texas, so Texas is unique amongst states is that we have one of the most inclusive definitions of giftedness. We try to capture everyone in the state. Districts are allowed to identify students as gifted in this state using almost any criteria they want. If you are a great artist, gifted. If you are a great athlete, gifted. If you are a great writer, gifted. Gifted, gifted, gifted. You know, that's what, that's very popular up here in North DFW area. One little thing about North DFW area that's interesting, and an interesting factoid to bring up Duke tip. The greatest population area or the greatest participants of Duke tip outside of North Carolina is the North DFW area. Plano, particularly Plano, Richardson, Frisco, Irving, Arlington. This is Duke tips. This is their big hunting ground outside of like people who want to spend money and send their kids to Duke. Dallas-Fort Worth is it. So there's like a Texas liaison here. They're always up here in DFW area. I know him, and very nice person. But they are very interested in how gifted education is viewed here. And one of the things that can kind of encapsulate this attitude of gifted education and its importance of the North DFW area is when Plano ISD organized bus trips to get all their parents to bus them down to the Capitol during the summer and support gifted education. They got them all together and bust them on down, and you'd have these big groups of Plano parents letting their state legislators know, we don't want anything messing up. We love our bumper stickers. We love, our support. I saw one the other day as I was thinking about this talk. My wife and I were driving through, and we saw one that said like honor student at like Frisco ISD, and I was like, oh, great, Or I think it was like Lamar Middle or Lamar Elementary, one of those where the parent had like a bumper sticker proudly proclaiming their student is gifted. So that was one of the things that Texas is very interested in. One other interesting factoid about gifted education that ties into this too. There's regionally in the United States, there is a difference of region of which states are more supportive or historically more supportive of gifted education than other states, historically. And gifted education, I'll give you a hint, right? Gifted education got its real big boost with two events. One that's used a lot is Sputnik, and the other is Brown versus the Board of Education. So I can give you a guess which states became champions of gifted education post-Brown and versus Board of Education. And there's a lot of thoughts of scholarship that it ties heavily to this. So you see big proponents of gifted ed were Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, big proponents of gifted education. Were they really worried about their children's success? Or was it like my district in Texas that got in trouble for having all of the little boys who are brown or black and in-school suspension in an elementary school, and all of the little children who are white in the gifted ed? So, but there's been a lot of work to kind of rectify this and amongst these states, and this definition was part of that. Part of that is trying to make this inclusive definition. So what do we look like in Texas? We've got one of the most inclusive definitions within the United States. We can capture anyone. A school district can almost say, look at any child and look at their talents and say, this is a gifted child. What do we look like? Well, it looks like this. Looks like everywhere else. So we see that, again, the students who are well represented are students who are Asian or white. And students who are less well represented are students who are Black, Latinx, or Native American. That's what we see. Texas is not unique to that as well. And I talked about, I've spent a lot on identification, because identification is a huge component of meeting a student's needs or meeting students' needs. And this goes back to special ed. That was the big thing, and self-contained, that you need to identify the student. You need to know what's going on with the student before you can provide an intervention. Same kind of thing here. We need to know which students need what intervention. So here are the next steps. This is the next steps of what scholars are pushing now, the big thing. So if you went to the National Association for Gifted Children, the big conference, the keynote speaker talked about local norming. What is local norming? Local norming is when instead of using like an overall national norm, like say 130 IQ, you use a district level. So maybe you take the top 5% of a district rather than comparing them across the state. So Dallas, if this were implemented in Dallas, the top 5% performers of Dallas ISD on some measure, regardless of their score, would be identified as gifted and be given services. To use this little context of this, in Indiana, when I was going through Purdue, there was this huge celebration in Gary. Gary is a predominantly community in the south, where Chicago clips the northern or northwestern portion of Indiana, and it's a largely community of individuals who are black there in Gary. And so Gary, there was a big news that came across was a child, the first time ever, a child in a Gary school, a young black girl, scored a 1600, a perfect score on their SAT. First time in the history of that entire independent school district. And so we talked about it a lot. Is a child in this environment who gets a 1600, is that 1600 the same as, say, a 1600 here in Richardson? Probably not. Probably not. And so that's where the idea of local norms come in, is that a child who can score a 90 when, in Gary is different than a child who scores a 90 in the equivalent of Richardson was Carmel. Carmel, Indiana, a very affluent suburb. It's just different, qualitatively different. That's where the idea of local norming comes in. There's been pushback against local norming. We have local norming already in Texas. Does anybody know our use of local norming? Tied to college admittance. Top 10 or top 10, top 7. Yeah, you can come in. Texas says we are opening the doors. Doesn't matter what your score is. If you are in the top X% of your school district, you can come on in. You can come on in. So we've tried that in Texas. And if you look at graduation rates among school districts, you will see a lot of parity amongst the freshman enrollment classes. And a lot of universities are very proud of this. I won't say UT and the UT systems. I'll use UNT. University of North Texas is very proud of its enrollment rates of its freshman class. They love putting that in banners. They love putting that on flyers. They love showcasing that. You're not going to find the graduation rate talked about so much. You're not going to find that. And I don't know about UNT or UT or want to say or UTD or the UT system and UTD or any of the colleges here in the DFW area. But if I had to guess, there might also be some pride on admittance and less pride on graduation, if I had to guess. So that's one of the things where you've seen pushback of local norming. We talked a lot about this in a seminar this past semester. If local norming is easy, why hasn't it been done? Why not? And a lot of these things of like all these other criteria, multiple pathways, things aren't as easy as they seem. Just, these racial ethnic categories are really a lot more complex than we give them credit for. I mean, Asian means a lot. My wife is Indian and South Indian, and she on her little is Asian. But when we, where she puts her ethnicity, her sense of ethnicity is Asian. And South India is a very different place than Guangdong, than China. It's very different. So even within those categories, the other one that has a little bit more progress that districts here in Texas are moving for is this idea of universal screening. So one of the issues that I talked about before, that teacher referral issue, is that a lot of times districts don't have a lot of money and universal screening is expensive. So they rely on parents and they rely on teachers to refer students for gifted ed. So one of the things that's being talked about is we just need to screen every kid that comes through. We need them all screened. Just give them a test and go. But there's been pushback from that. Kids take a lot of tests. Little kindergarten bodies or little bodies take dibbles. They take everything under the sun, especially would like to kind of get where their literacy is at. And as they go up, that testing doesn't kind of slow down either. So when I was at Purdue, one of the professors who was a former superintendent put it a good way, a very colloquial Indiana way. he said, because he was talking about testing, and he said, I don't think weighing a hog every week is going to make it gain weight. That's, yeah, that was an Indiana way of putting things. His way of thinking. What he meant was testing kids over and over and over again isn't going to make them perform higher. But he said, put that hog on the scale, I don't think it's going to gain anything. So universal screening, the issues of, even though research has suggested where universal screening has been used, it has closed the gaps in representation, and not in the way where the students who are well represented have been brought down. Florida tried it, worked out great. There are districts in Texas who are trying to use it. The issue is with this situation is cost. Costs get in the way. A superintendent will say, I'd rather hire a teacher. I'd rather hire another let's get a teacher down in the reading or literacy intervention room. Let's get them there, RTI. That's what we need. So here's the last thing. So we spent a lot on identification and now on meeting the needs. And this is the big question that we ask. Gifted education for what? For what? Why are we giving them services? That's what scholars are talking about. If we're going to identify them, so for example, if you use an alternative identification or you identify a student like in Texas, say a school district in Texas is using the full brunt of the definition to identify students as gifted with artistic ability, with kinesthetic ability, with all these other things. And they said, okay, to AP Calculus you go now. We've identified you as gifted. You are gifted. Head on in. Oh, you haven't taken any math prerequisites. Don't worry, you can do it. You got this label now. Don't worry, you've got it. So that's one of the things that's talked about a lot, that the identification has to align with the services provided. If you're giving, like, say, for example, if services are in a school district are enrichment-based, where the gifted services they're getting to do like cool fun stuff, they're getting to do projects, you don't need an IQ test for that. You don't need that. If you're on the other hand, where your gifted services are, they're taking they're having a college professor come into middle school and you're working with, like graph theory, you probably need a more rigorous identification system rather than putting a child into a room which they might not have the background yet to be successful. Because a lot of times children might have the ability to be successful, but they might not have the background yet to be successful in it. So that's one of the things that we talk about a lot, where what you do has to really align with how you are identifying the student. And we have seen, there's a big study going on at UConn that's looking at the mismatch between those two, where you'll have districts who do this kind of identification and then this kind of services, and there's almost no alignment between the two. That gets to be a big problem where rural districts. And rural districts, it's not necessarily, again, this goes back to resources. A rural district will defer to the region, like here in Texas. They'll contact the region gifted coordinator and say, hey, we got a gifted program. What can we do? We don't have any money to develop a plan. The region coordinator might give them the state plan and say, run with this, But rural districts have things that they can offer to students that maybe a suburban or urban district might not have. Like, for example, my wife grew up in Houston. She couldn't pick out the constellations in the sky. I grew up in Gonzales. That's where I taught. And Gonzales is very rural. I can pick them out. And that's just because we've had different backgrounds and different things that we are capable of doing, different ways that we are able to express our intelligence. So you have to think about gifted for what. And in closing, it's to kind of encapsulate everything. When you think about identification, gosh, people want to make it simple. People want to make it easy. It's not fun to think about the complexity that might arise why a child might not be as successful on a test as another child. You might not like those answers, and sometimes they're very complex, and sometimes the solutions to them are much harder than they can be and require a multi-pronged approach that isn't just the school. You have the criminal justice system, you have access to health and nutrition, you have access to early literacy programs, literacy-rich environments. I mean, these are societal issues, and this underrepresentation isn't, the way I see it, it's not so much a cause of inequity as it is to a thermometer that shows it. It's one of those things like a manifestation. There's some ills, societal ills, and this is a manifestation of it. And so that's where I differ a little bit, and some of the pushback that's coming in, say from New York or Seattle, that's saying we just need to get rid of it. It's not working, we're getting rid of it, we're just getting away with it. The way I see it, and I had someone talk to me, And my experiences working in Gonzales have heavily shaped this. Gonzales is a Title I district. It has about, I want to say, pushing about 90% free and reduced lunch. Maybe 85% students who are Latinx, about maybe 30, 40% who are ELL, rural. You can probably imagine what a district might look like that in Texas. And I would think to myself, if what it takes to help this child who might not have get into honors and then go on to SAT and then go on to college is so some other parent can put a bumper sticker on their car. You know, if that's the price I have to pay as an educator to do this, that's not such a bad of a price. You know, if someone else can, yes, we know that this is, gifted ed can be a conduit for vanity. We know it. You know, there have been studies that show it, that it is a conduit for vanity, but it can also be a conduit to help students without access gain access and gain things that maybe their family would wish they can provide and want to provide but cannot. So it can act like a little bit of a subsidy. So that's it for me. Thank you guys a bunch. Any questions?
We have about 10 minutes or so for questions. I have a microphone if anybody wants to ask a question. I can start off with one. So you were talking about there's different ways of working with children who are gifted or teenagers who are gifted. There's enrichment type programs where the kids go outside the class and do something cool that they wouldn't be doing in their classroom. And there's more acceleration kinds of programs. Right. So they're not meeting their needs in the normal classroom. They're acting up because they knew that math stuff 4 years ago and they're now still doing it. There's different approaches to take. Is there evidence about what's best, particularly for these underrepresented minorities? Is anything better than nothing? What do we know or not?
So that's where I focus, because we're talking about underrepresented populations. There isn't as much research. Like we can say, like I'll use Duke Tip as an example. If your child is 4 levels above grade level and they're largely from an affluent family, they're really going to benefit from acceleration. They're going to benefit from early entrance to college. They're going to benefit from advanced curriculum. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that. There's a lot of evidence that provides it. And there's evidence that stretches back to the 1900s, the Terman studies, where someone can reanalyze that data and say that if you provide a child from an affluent background who is above ability with advanced and accelerated curriculum, they're going to do very well. So we know that. What we don't have as much a grip on is how these interventions work for students who are alternatively identified. That's where there's a lot of shakiness, and that's why there's so much focus on identification, is because we don't have a grip or a good grasp on interventions that work. We do know, like with some research, that qualitative work that has been done where students from more marginalized backgrounds are put into situations where nobody knows anybody else's background and they're provided with an intervention, like an enrichment intervention, that they respond to it just as well as anybody else. So the idea that they'll be like starstruck or it'll be too much, that's, at least as the qualitative evidence has shown, that's not really the case. There hasn't been as much quantitative evidence to kind of look at that and look at this to be able to generalize those kind of findings. So that's a tricky area.
Future research, right?
Yes.
There was a question back here.
So I'm not as familiar with the education costs behind this, but my question has to do with identifying gifted students from underrepresented populations, so minorities.
Sure.
Is there a fine if they don't use more of a dynamic assessment to identify these kiddos? So for instance, I come from a speech path language background, so the recommendation is to assess dual language learners, synonymous to ELLs, English language learners, using a more dynamic assessment that isn't based on normed reference tools. So whenever you spoke about that 130 IQ, do they even look at the norms of that 130 IQ test, and if it was normed on monolingual speaking white children, how many times was that test administered, like that test retest reliability? Are there any fines that the school districts face for not adequately assessing children?
That's a really good question, and this kind of goes back to where I discovered. So from the self-contained room to gifted ed, and it's like what you said. And self-contained, if you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, you get in trouble, your license can get in trouble, you might get your license revoked, your district is definitely going to be in trouble. So there are heavy penalties associated with non-compliance, which is what you're referring to. Gifted education is governed under local control. So with the context of local control in the state, even though there's this overarching policy in Texas, even within the DFW area, gifted education program in like Mansfield is going to look different than gifted education in, say, here in Richardson. It's going to look different in Dallas. It's just, you have this, even with this in small geographic area, you're going to see a lot of diversity because districts are able to say what does gifted mean, and based on that, they're able to administer the test that they want, and they're able to provide the services that they want.
Right, and that's an issue though, because if a student moves from one district
Oh,
to
that's
another,
a big
they
issue.
may not be identified as gifted anymore, right?
Yes.
And then they may not qualify for, like, I've in my readings of literature, that's a huge problem that I've identified, and it just seems like the discrepancy is just ridiculous. And we're not affording kids the opportunities that they need. And one more question.
Sure.
Are those numbers by any chance the same in private schools?
No, those are the numbers that I showed are all public schools. So in Texas, like at least in there, the private schools are governed differently. Like here in Texas, a charter doesn't have to provide gifted services if it's not within its charter. And that being the case, because that costs more money, most charter schools do not include gifted services. They might say, like Hope would say, all of our service, we meet the needs of everybody, like the Hope Academy. That's a very tricky issue. And also in Texas, the other one that's not allowed to give gifted services are non-open enrollment schools, like Austin's School for the Blind and Deaf don't technically have to provide services since they're non-open enrollment, or like a school that's serves students and juvenile delinquents don't technically have to provide gifted services because they're non-open enrollment.
We have time for one more question. Yeah.
I would just like to hear your comment to this. So fairly recently, a few months ago, I was in Houston with my grandchildren and children, and their daughter, who is entering kindergarten, went to the Townsend Gifted Testing, pre-kindergarten. This was on a Saturday morning. Every child was taken individually by one tester for almost an hour's time and tested. And of course, huge, cafeteria filled with,
Sure.
with these families. And of course, this is parents signing up for this, and so, who knows about this is one thing, but what do you think about that? And then they retest and retest. If you don't get in that time, well, there'll be a test in another year or two. But this is a huge
Yes, it is.
amount of.
And he's 4?
Yeah, four, 5. I mean, just in the year before kindergarten. And it's going on in several elementary
Yes.
schools throughout Houston on certain dates. That's a lot of money.
Yes, so I will say before I answer that, this is a question that I'm very biased against. In Gonzales, there are little kids, we called them, who came in as like unshaped lumps of clay into the school. They had no background in literacy, no background in mathematics. They were just, we'd call them like unshaped lumps, unshaped pieces of clay that you as a teacher get to exert all the influence on. And there are other kids who come to school that are able to, have a lot of background in literacy, write their names. Some kids are very proud. Let me show, a little hand cursive, that they can do, little hand cursive. So when you're giving tests to a group of students where there are differential access to literacy, especially where these things are magnified, you're going to get differential outcomes. And earlier, states have moved away from this. In the early days of gifted ed, certain states were very large proponents of early testing. They found something out. They found if you test students in kindergarten, you're going to have a whole group of classroom which is predominantly affluent little white boys and girls. And if you test later, it will be more diverse. So we're going to say early testing, kindergarten testing, where money and access have some of the biggest influence on literacy. It's hard to do well on a test, even these nonverbal tests. They'll say, oh, it's nonverbal, in that. if you haven't been exposed, or you haven't, not just exposure to that, but also adequate nutrition, different terms of safety, all these other issues that kind of progress. So I am very biased towards that question, and I am less of a proponent of early identification, but I understand that that stems from, gosh, coming and working with kids who only eat at school. They eat breakfast and they eat lunch, and that's when they eat, and they don't go home and eat. Working in that kind of environment can kind of shape your attitudes towards how effective certain interventions might be. So I'm very skeptical, but I understand the reasoning of why in areas of Houston might be more interested in this. If I have time to kind of relate one more anecdote, that kind of relates to this, why I think this in certain areas of Houston might push this. In Raleigh-Durham, where I was a postdoc at Duke, there was a big issue where one of the school districts there, Apex, was going to change the gifted identification standards. They're going to change it because there was an issue of diversity. They wanted to identify more students who are Latinx and more students who are Black for the gifted education program. And Apex is one of in Raleigh-Durham has a very large population of people who are from India, especially large population of people who are immigrants from India. And the parents from this group heard that the school district, they interpreted this as the school district was lowering standards. So they collectively got together, and when the school board elections came up, they voted out the school board. And they voted in people from their community within the school board, and from the school board, they put a stop to that intervention. They said, no, we are not doing this. And I thought a lot about this. I thought a lot. We talk about this in our doctoral student, or in our doctoral class, of what might make a parent motivated to do something like this, or motivated. People, and I remember this, and when I taught pre-service teachers, I would tell them this too. When you are sitting across the seat in your parent-teacher conference, remember that person you're talking about, the kid you're talking about, the person sitting across from you loves their child, loves that child you're talking about. I love them. And no amount of numbers that you show them and no amount of anything else will make them not love that child you were talking about. And so in this case, even though this intervention was something that could brought about greater equity within the district, you had a group of parents who said, we are not doing this, because they felt that this would undermine their own children's education. And so we've thought a lot about this in gifted education, and Austin is going through this right now, where some of these interventions have to be changed, have to be reframed in a way, not maybe in terms of saying that have to be reframed in such a way that everyone understands how their child benefits from them. Or in the case of early identification, where maybe it might not be beneficial to a child or less beneficial, what are we measuring? So the school district might not be able to come across and say, we want to be able to better bring about increased equity within the district. You might have populations of parents who might be not as for that. Or for that is not the right word. They use coded terms of lowering standards. That's usually the coded language that's used a lot. You might want to say it is, we want to be better able to measure a child's ability rather than their access to resources. So that's usually a better way that has to be framed. So a lot of these interventions have to be talked about in terms of framing. At least in that. That's at least one of the anecdotes I've thought about a lot.
Thank you very much. I have a few quick announcements. That actually connects really nicely to our next talk of this series. So I want to let you know about our next two talks. Our next talk is on March 27th by Dr. Selena Brody. She's going to be talking about conversations that create change, talking to kids about injustice. And I think what you were mentioning just then, this idea of how we think about people who are different from us, how we talk to our kids about those sorts of issues are important for us to discuss. And then the last talk of the series is going to be on April 17th by Dr. Megan Swanson on talking to babies, the universal ingredient for language learning. So I think that'll be interesting as well. Two more announcements. First, you have a feedback form. You can put that on the table on your way out. And then last, we have a reception across the hallway. There's a room for the Center for Teaching and Learning that they've generously let us borrow for today. There's some snacks and some coffee and things like that. So feel free to join us over there, and you can talk to Dr. Hodges if you have any questions. Hope to see you there. Thank you.